The night after Miriam's funeral, I sat alone in the living room, while her coffee mug still rested on the side table, the imprint of her last morning, etched into our home. She used to handle our bills with a kind of gentle seriousness, telling me she didn't want me worrying while I managed the bigger burdens of our life. I believed her. A man wants to believe the woman he loves. But grief makes you see things differently. When I opened her online accounts to sort out what she left behind, something caught my eye. A recurring payment, then another, every month. Same date, same amount. A charity I had never heard mentioned not once in our 27 years together. Helping Hands Community Fund. The name made my skin prickle. It didn't fit the pattern of anything Miriam supported. No website, no tax ID, no phone number. Just a P.O. box in a part of Ohio she never visited. And the amounts, they weren't small. They rose slowly, like someone tightening a rope. At first I told myself it was nothing. A bookkeeping quirk. Something harmless. But men like me learn early that harmless things don't hide in the dark for 6 years. So the next morning I drove to the listed address, hoping for clarity, expecting confusion, praying for something that made sense. What I found instead was a place no charity would ever claim. And in that moment, standing in the cold wind with her bank statement in my hand, I understood something I wish I could forget. The woman I buried had a life I never fully knew, and I was about to walk straight into the part she died trying to keep hidden. 3 days after we buried Miriam, I walked back into our home on Sycamore Hill, a place that used to breathe with her voice. That morning, the light coming through the kitchen window felt wrong, too sharp, almost intrusive, like it was searching for someone who was no longer here. I stood in the doorway for a long time, holding my coat in my hand, unsure whether to hang it up or turn around and leave again. Grief has a way of turning simple things into decisions that feel impossible. I finally forced myself to sit at the dining table, the same table where Miriam and I had eaten every breakfast for almost 3 decades. Her paperwork was stacked neatly in a box the hospice nurse had handed me. I opened it to keep my hands busy, but the quiet in the room pressed against me until it felt like a physical weight. I used to spend long nights reviewing security reports and internal audits, but nothing prepared me for the loneliness of sorting my wife's medical bills and bank statements. Halfway through the folder, I stopped. There was a recurring line on the bank ledger, Helping Hands Community Fund. The name sounded harmless, like something you would hear on a public radio pledge drive, but my eyes froze on the details. 6 straight years of monthly transfers, no EIN number listed, no tax-deductible notation. The amounts rose steadily, starting small and then climbing without any explanation. $250, $600, $1,000. Then a final transfer of $5,400 a month before she died. I leaned back in my chair, trying to breathe. For 30 years at Mid-States Freight Security, I trained younger investigators to spot patterns of coercion, patterns that hid in plain sight. Escalating payments were always a sign that someone was tightening a grip. And Miriam had hidden this from me with the same steady hands that once pressed bandages on my knuckles when I came home from a bad shift. I spread out her Medicare statements on the table. The numbers didn't add up. Her treatments never came close to what she withdrew. She had lied to me, not out of malice. I knew her too well for that. But the betrayal still cut. It was the kind of lie born from fear, the kind that grows in silence until it takes root in every corner of a home. I reached for her purse, still hanging on the kitchen chair, where she left it the week before the hospice bed arrived. Inside was a note folded so tightly it looked like she meant for it to survive a war. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had always curled her letters in a way no one else did. If I'm gone, please don't let them find Eli. I whispered the name out loud. Eli. It didn't belong to anyone in our family, not to any friend she ever mentioned. The name tasted unfamiliar, like a word from another language. My chest tightened as I read the note again. Miriam never pleaded, not once in our marriage. If she wrote something like this, she was terrified. The only lead I had was the address tied to the so-called charity, a P.O. box in a small town outside Toledo. I checked the routing address and found it forwarded to a trailer park on the edge of Dayton, a place known more for abandoned machinery and winter floods than nonprofit work. By late afternoon, I got in my truck and drove out there myself. The January sky was the color of cold steel, and every mile of highway felt like I was driving deeper into someone else's secret. I pulled off at the Maple Ridge exit, followed a cracked county road, passed a shuttered gas station, and slowed when I saw the trailer park sign crooked on its hinges. Nothing about that place resembled a charity. On my way back to Cincinnati, I noticed headlights far behind me. At first, it seemed like normal traffic, but the vehicle kept the exact same distance no matter how I adjusted my speed. I tested it the way I used to teach rookies. Slow to 40. The car slowed. Push to 60. The car pushed. Never close enough to be a tail. Never far enough to dismiss. A black SUV, dark windows, no front plate. A perfect surveillance trail, clean enough that most people would never notice. But I wasn't most people. Years of hunting internal theft and courier schemes had drilled the pattern into my bones. Whoever sat behind that wheel wasn't curious. They were watching. And they had been watching long before today. When I turned onto my street, the SUV slipped away behind a row of pines as if it had never been there. I sat in the driveway for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house where my wife had kept secrets big enough to follow me, even after her death. Something Miriam hid didn't die with her, and whatever it was had just started breathing down my neck. I stepped out of the truck, the cold biting through my jacket, knowing this was only the beginning. The cold air settled around me as I crossed the yard, the memory of that SUV still tight in my chest. I kept replaying the way it eased behind the pines like a hunter slipping back into the brush. For a moment I stood there in the driveway, staring at the front porch light that Miriam insisted we leave on every night. It flickered now, as if unsure whether to stay alive. I told myself I would deal with it later, but grief has a way of turning even electricity into a reminder. I drove out again at first light, heading toward the trailer park outside Dayton. The sky was low and colorless, and the frost on the fields made everything look abandoned. I followed the GPS through a maze of county roads until the asphalt broke into gravel. The trailers appeared like a line of rusted ships wrecked in a field of scrub grass. By the time I stepped out of the truck, the air smelled of diesel and damp insulation. The last trailer was the one on my notes. Windows covered with strips of duct tape siding faded to the color of old pennies. I knocked once. No sound. I knocked again, harder. The door jerked open, and a thin man pointed a pistol at my chest. His hand shook so much I could see the barrel quiver. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with eyes that looked like they had seen too many winters. When I said the name Miriam, the tension drained from him. He lowered the pistol and stepped aside long enough for me to see the inside of the trailer. The place was dim and smelled faintly of mold. A single lamp cast a weak glow over a table covered in unopened mail and half-empty bottles of water. He asked me who I was, without looking me in the eye. I told him I was Miriam's husband. He let out a breath that seemed to come from deeper than his lungs. "She said you would come," he said. "Later than she hoped, but you made it." I stepped inside, still cautious. The trailer groaned under each footstep. I asked him his name, and he said it softly. Caleb Moore. He had the look of a man who had been watching shadows for too many years. I asked him why my wife sent him money. He rubbed the back of his neck, pacing once before answering. It wasn't for him. It was for someone named Eli. I pressed him for more, but he clammed up after speaking the name like saying it cost him something. Caleb walked to a metal cabinet near the table and took out a steel lockbox. He set it between us. Miriam brought this to me a few months before she died. Told me if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to you. He slid it across the table. The weight of it against my palms felt like the weight of her silence all over again. Before I could ask more, Caleb pressed a small folded note into my hand. Trust no one who worked at Mid-States Freight before 2005. His voice dropped as if the walls themselves were listening. I asked why, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved to the window and lifted the edge of the duct tape. His jaw tightened. A black SUV had parked along a ridge in the distance. It sat still, engine off, angled slightly toward us. I felt my stomach drop. The same vehicle from Cincinnati. Caleb whispered that they had been circling the area for days. Not for him, for me. He told me the truth in fragments, as if each memory hurt to pull out. Back in 1998, during a chase near a freight yard outside Toledo, he had been cornered by men involved in a laundering ring operating through transport logistics. Miriam had happened to be there. She pulled him into her car and drove him out before they could reach him. From then on, someone made sure she stayed quiet. I asked him who. He shook his head. It isn't one person. This thing has roots. Miriam got caught up in it because she cared too much and trusted the wrong people, and because she loved you enough to take the pressure instead. He said the threats grew worse after Henry Walsh died. The people who took over wanted every loose end wrapped tight. Caleb said Miriam never stopped shielding others even when she was sick. She told him she was buying me time, buying all of us time, though she never explained how she thought time could save anyone. Before I could press him further, Caleb moved toward the doorway and nodded for me to leave. I asked him why he was pushing me out so quickly. He looked past my shoulder toward the ridge where the SUV had been. It was gone. They're watching everything, he said. And they're looking for you now, too. It wasn't a warning said in panic. It was the voice of a man who had lived on the run long enough to know when the circle was closing. I stepped outside into the brittle morning air, feeling the weight of the lockbox in my hand, and for a moment the world felt smaller. The frost, the gravel, the silence, everything around me carried a tremor I couldn't ignore. When I reached my truck, I glanced back. Caleb stood in the doorway, like a shadow already fading into the dimness of the trailer behind him. I wanted to say something more, ask one last question, anything. But he shut the door before I could speak. As I pulled away from the lot, the wind whipped dust across the hood, and the road ahead narrowed into a ribbon of cracked asphalt. I kept checking the mirror, waiting for the SUV to appear again. It didn't. Which somehow felt worse. I drove on the lockbox beside me, knowing whatever Miriam had been fighting was only beginning to reveal itself. The drive home felt heavier than the lockbox sitting in the passenger seat. The farther I got from that trailer park, the more the morning light dimmed into something colder. Caleb's warning echoed in the back of my mind. By the time I turned onto Sycamore Hill, I felt like I had carried someone else's fear into my own house. Inside, the quiet met me again, but this time it felt sharper, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to open that box. I set it on the dining table and sat there for a long moment with the lid in my hand. Part of me didn't want to know what Miriam had kept from me, but ignorance had already cost her too much. I lifted the lid and the hinges groaned, revealing dozens of envelopes tied together with twine. 47 letters, each sealed but never mailed. Her handwriting covered every one of them. Seeing her writing after weeks of reading medical invoices felt strangely intimate, as if she were whispering through paper. I opened the first letter and found it addressed to a boy named Eli. She wrote about watching him grow from afar, about trying to protect him, about the shadows around his life she could not chase away. I read another letter, this one to Caleb. She thanked him for keeping distance from Samuel. She called me that in her letters, as if she wanted to separate the husband she loved from the man tied to a past she feared I would uncover. Guilt threaded through every sentence. She apologized for not doing more. She begged him to stay safe. Then I began seeing it. A name repeated so many times my hands went cold. Henry Walsh. His name sat in the middle of her sentences like ash. In 1998, I had tried to open an internal investigation into him at Mid-States Freight Security. He was a supervisor, then confident in a way that never sat right. When the corporate office shut my probe down without explanation, I knew something was wrong. What I did not know was how deeply Miriam had been pulled into the fallout. One letter had a torn section, as if she ripped it out, then tried to tape it back before giving up. The fragment revealed more than any of the complete letters. Henry had threatened her decades ago. If she ever told anyone what she saw the night of the so-called accident in 1998, he would plant evidence to frame me for the hit-and-run death of a young woman. He knew I was nearby that night, responding to a late-shift call. One lie from him, and I could have spent the rest of my life trying to convince a jury I had never touched that car. Reading those words made me feel like the floor had tilted. Miriam had carried that fear for 20 years, shielding me from a man I once sat beside in conference rooms. I tried to picture her walking around our home with this weight in her chest, choosing silence because she believed it was the only way to keep me safe. It made my throat close. I pushed back from this table and stood up, pacing the kitchen. The kettle on the stove still had a faint stain from the last time she used it. The house smelled like lemon soap and winter dust. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. When I finally sat back down, I finished the torn letter. She mentioned a child. Eli. She wrote that he lost more than anyone knew, and that she could not let Henry's threats reach him. The letters read like confessions, each one cut open by fear. Later that afternoon, I called Caleb again, though I wasn't confident he would answer. He picked up after the fourth ring, breathless, as if he had been startled. I asked him who Eli was. There was a long silence, then he spoke in a low, tight voice. Eli is the son of the woman Henry killed, the woman from the accident. Henry ran her down because she had proof of the laundering ring. Miriam saw it. She was the only witness left alive. Hearing it out loud hit differently. If that was true, then everything Miriam had done, every dollar she sent, every lie she told me about rising medical bills came from trying to protect a boy whose life had been shattered before he could even speak. And Henry was willing to frame me to cover the truth. Even dead, his shadow still stretched across my life. I walked to the windows and pulled back the curtain. Nothing outside moved except a couple joggers and an old man walking his dog. But after the SUV, I no longer trusted the comfort of a quiet street. That evening, as I stepped onto the porch to take in a breath of cold air, I noticed something lying on the welcome mat. No one had knocked. No car had pulled up. It was an envelope without a return address. I picked it up and felt the weight of a photograph inside. I opened it under the porch light. The picture was dated July 2013. Miriam was kneeling in a field, her arms wrapped around a boy who looked about 10, smiling at the camera with a softness I had not seen in her eyes for years. The boy looked up at her like she was the safest person in his world. On the back of the photo, written in hurried pen strokes, were 4 words. "He is waiting for you." I stood there a long time, the cold seeping into my hands. It was no longer about bank transfers or a charity that never existed. It was about a boy my wife loved in silence, and a past she tried to keep buried beneath our marriage. And somewhere out there, someone else knew I had opened the lockbox. The photograph stayed on the table all night, its edges curling slightly under the kitchen light. I must have picked it up a dozen times, tracing Miriam's smile with my thumb studying the boy beside her. There was a strip of chain-link fence behind them, and beyond that I could just make out a faded sign. Part of a word. Yards. I knew those yards. Cincinnati has a way of reusing and abandoning the same pieces of land over and over. The rail lines on the west side have more ghosts than trains these days. By morning I had a pot of coffee cooling on the counter, and a plan forming whether I liked it or not. I pulled out my old laptop, the one I used when I still handled audits at Mid-States. I scanned the photo, blew it up, sharpened the background until the pixels bled. Rail cars, graffiti I recognized from the freight security reports I used to review, a rusted water tower with a chipped logo. It placed them near the old Western Avenue yards, not far from an area I knew too well for all the wrong reasons. People who drift end up near tracks. The rent is cheaper, the neighbors ask fewer questions, and the sound of trains covers a lot of things you do not want heard. By noon, I was driving past at the rail yards, the skyline of Cincinnati hazy in the winter air behind me. Rows of brick warehouses slumped against each other, some converted to storage, some left to rot, a few carved into rooming houses, with crooked mailboxes and sagging porches. I parked on a side street that smelled like oil and old beer, and started walking, the photo in my pocket. The building that matched the background was 3 stories of tired red brick with peeling white trim. A crooked sign by the front door announced weekly rentals in faded marker. The main door was cracked open. That was my first bad sign. The second was the splintered wood near the lock, the smear of dirt where a shoulder had pushed too hard. Inside the hallway was narrow and dark, lit by a single bulb that flickered every few seconds. I stepped over a pile of takeout containers and moved toward the room numbers scratched on the doors. When I reached 2B, I did not have to guess. The door frame was splintered, the door itself hanging slightly off its hinges. I pushed with 2 fingers and it swung in. Someone had been thorough. Drawers pulled out and dumped, mattress half off the frame, clothes scattered like leaves across the floor. A cheap lamp lay on its side, shade broken. Footprints pressed into the film of dust, more than one size overlapping. They were not looking for cash or a television. They were looking for something specific. I stepped inside and did what I had done 100 times in warehouse offices that had been tossed by angry employees. I let my eyes adjust and tried to see the room as it used to be. A small dresser, a narrow bed, a metal chair by the window. A backpack in the corner, half unzipped. Whoever tore the place apart had not bothered with that. People in a hurry miss things they do not understand. Behind me, a faint scrape of metal on metal broke the silence. I turned slowly. The fire escape window was open a few inches. A shadow moved along the outer railing, then a face appeared in the gap. A young man, maybe 20, eyes sharp and wary, one hand gripping the frame. In his other hand he held a folding knife blade, out knuckles white. We stared at each other for a long second. I did not move. When you are in security long enough, you learn how fast fear can turn into something worse. I raised my hands, slightly empty. "I am looking for Eli," I said. "I am not here to hurt you." He narrowed his eyes. His voice was rough when he spoke. "Who sent you?" "Your mother's friend," I said. "Miriam." The name changed him. It was visible like a string had been cut inside. His shoulders dropped, the knife lowered a couple of inches. For a moment, he looked less like a cornered animal and more like a kid who had run too far and could not catch his breath. He climbed through the window and stepped into the room, keeping distance between us. Up close, I could see the resemblance to the boy in the picture. Same dark hair, same eyes. But the softness was gone, replaced by something harder. "You are Samuel," he said. "She talked about you." That hit me harder than I expected. I told him yes, I was Miriam's husband. I said she was gone, though. The words felt strange in my mouth, as if saying them made it more final. His jaw clenched. He sat down on the edge of the bed, avoiding the broken springs. "They were here," he said. "Two men. They asked about a drive, asked if she sent me something before she died. They tore the place apart when I would not answer. I asked him if they were police, but I already knew the answer." He shook his head. "They did not have that kind of patience." I took a breath and asked him what he knew about 1998. At first he did not respond. Then slowly, he started to talk. His voice stayed calm, but his hands told a different story. His fingers picked at a loose thread on the blanket until it almost snapped. "My mom worked in a freight office near Toledo," he said. "She kept records, invoices, routing logs. She was good with numbers. One night she realized the numbers did not make sense. Containers were listed twice or not at all. Money was flowing in ways it should not. She started keeping copies at home." He paused, looking past me to the window. "She told me we were going to do the right thing. Take what she found to the authorities. She was scared, but she thought truth still mattered. Then one night, on the way to meet someone, a truck came out of nowhere. It did not stop. It never even slowed down. I saw flashes as he spoke. Headlights on wet pavement. A car on its side. The kind of scene I had stood near more than once in my line of work. I asked him how he knew it was not an accident. He looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. "Because the driver got out," he said. "My mom was still alive. She saw his face. So did someone else." He said Miriam's name soft like it hurt. "She saw Henry do it," he said. "She saw him take the papers from my mom's car. He thought no one else saw, but she did. And he knew she did." Henry Walsh. The man whose investigation I tried to open that same year. The man corporate protected without telling me why. The pieces shifted in my mind, falling into a pattern I hated. Eli went on. "Henry found Miriam later. Told her if she ever said anything, he would make sure the blame fell on someone close to her. A security chief near the scene that night. Someone with enough access that a few false reports could ruin his life. I did not have to ask who he meant." I sat down in the metal chair, the weight of it all pressing inward. Eli watched me as if trying to decide whether I was another threat or someone worth trusting. "She sent me something before she went back to the hospital," he said. "Said it was the only thing that could straighten this out if she could not." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive wrapped in a strip of tissue. "She said only you and I would know the password." I took it carefully, feeling its cold plastic against my fingers. I asked him if he had tried to open it. He shook his head. "I do not have a computer," he said. "And I figured if those guys wanted it that bad, maybe I should not be the one to see what is on it." We left the room together an hour later after I helped him gather the few things that had not been broken. I gave him some cash, told him to stay somewhere busy and anonymous for a couple of nights. A bus station, a 24-hour diner, places where being watched is normal. On my way home, I stopped at St. Peter's Medical Center, the hospital where Miriam had spent her last weeks. Old habits took over. I asked to speak to the head of security, a man named Rick I had worked with on a couple of cargo theft cases years ago. We talked in his cramped office that smelled like burnt coffee. I told him I needed to see camera footage from the corridor outside Miriam's room. I did not give him all the reasons, but I gave him enough. Maybe it was the years we had under our belts, or maybe it was the way my voice sounded when I said my wife's name, but he agreed. About an hour later, we watched the screen together as time stamps rolled past in gray numbers. For days, the corridor was empty except for nurses and the occasional volunteer. Then 3 nights before she died at 2 a.m, a man appeared on the screen. Blue scrub pants, white shoes, a hospital cart in front of him. He swiped a badge, but the system flagged it as a mismatch for the name on the overlay. The camera caught his face as he pushed open Miriam's door. I leaned closer. Even with a few more years on him, I knew that jawline. Those eyes, the family resemblance. It was not Henry. Henry had died in that warehouse fire. It was his son. The image of Thomas Walsh walking into Miriam's hospital room stayed with me long after I left the security office. It clung to my thoughts the entire drive home, a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. I kept replaying the moment he turned his head toward the camera, just enough for me to see the echo of his father in the lines of his face. Henry Walsh may have died in that warehouse fire 4 years earlier, but his legacy had survived in a son who understood exactly how to use fear the same way Henry once did. By the time I reached Sycamore Hill again, the daylight had thinned into a cold gray. I sat in the kitchen with the flash drive Eli had given me, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I plugged the drive into my old laptop, half expecting it to be empty or corrupted. Instead, a single file appeared marked with a date only a week before Miriam went to the hospital for the last time. When I opened it, her voice filled the room, soft, strained, a voice trying to stay strong for someone else. She spoke as if she were talking to me directly, explaining things she should never have had to carry alone. She said she kept Henry's evidence because she knew he would use me as a scapegoat the moment he felt threatened. She said she wanted to protect Eli too, protect anyone who could not protect themselves. She apologized for the secrecy, but she said she believed I would forgive her someday when I understood. Hearing her speak about fear as if it had lived beside her every day for 20 years made my hands shake. She ended the recording with a message. "Find Jack. He will help you." I closed the laptop and stared at the screen reflection, seeing a version of myself I barely recognized. There was only one Jack she could mean. Jack O'Connor, retired Ohio State Police detective, a man I had once trusted on joint cases before he stepped away from the badge. I had not spoken to him in years, but I still had his number stored in my phone. He answered on the second ring, voice as gravelly as ever. I told him Miriam had passed, and for a moment he was silent, offering the kind of condolences men give each other when they do not know how to say they are sorry. When I told him about Henry, and about the evidence, and about the threats, he stopped breathing for a moment. Then he asked me where I was and said he would come over. Jack arrived with his old field jacket zipped to his neck shoulders, hunched like the cold had followed him inside. He listened to the recording without interrupting, though I saw his jaw tighten. When it ended, he rubbed his hand over his face. "The case should never have been closed," he said. "Not the way it was. Too many people upstairs wanted it gone." I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded slowly. "I knew something was wrong. I did not know they forced it shut." He told me he still had access to certain databases, old favors that had not expired. He offered to look into Caleb to see if he had ties to anyone still active in Henry's network. I gave him everything I knew and watched as he typed into a secure laptop he kept in his truck. It took only an hour for him to find a lead. A closed-circuit camera outside a storage warehouse near the Kentucky riverfront caught Caleb's truck arriving 2 nights earlier. It caught another vehicle following him. The footage cut out soon after, but Jack had seen enough. He suggested we drive down there before the storm rolling in covered any remaining tracks. The warehouse district was quiet when we arrived, rows of old metal buildings lining the water like abandoned husks. Jack parked a block away, and we approached on foot. The door to the warehouse hung crooked, its chain cut. Inside, the air smelled of rust and river mud. A streak of dark red stained the concrete near the loading ramp. Nearby lay zip ties and a torn jacket sleeve. Jack crouched to examine the drag marks. Caleb did not walk out of here, he said. Whoever took him wanted answers he did not give. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Caleb had been scared, but he still talked to me. He gave me the box, the note, and now he was gone because of it. Back outside, the wind picked up, cutting across the river and rattling loose metal. We stood there looking at the water, knowing we were running out of time. Jack said he had checked Caleb's name through legal channels before we left Cincinnati. His attorney had received a package that morning, set to deliver only if Caleb failed to check in. A dead man switch. We drove straight to the law office in Covington. The attorney, a gray-haired man with polite eyes and the kind of face that suggested he had seen too many frightened clients, led us into a back room. He handed me the package. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. The real drive isn't where they're looking. Only someone who worked night security at Mid-States would know the place. She trusted you to figure it out. I folded the letter and stared at it. Night security. Mid-States. My old routes, my old codes, my old storage maps. There was a place Henry never knew about. A place only I and a handful of men from that era even remembered. Miriam must have known I would trace my steps, and she hid the evidence where only someone who once walked those dark hallways could find it. The realization hit me hard. The threat that shadowed her for 20 years had shifted. It had new eyes now, new hands, and it had come full circle. I slipped the letter into my coat, knowing everything was tightening around me, just as it had around her. The thought followed me out of the attorney's office and into the cold Kentucky air, everything tightening around me the same way it had closed around Miriam. As I drove back toward Cincinnati with Jack following in his truck, the sky darkened into the kind of winter dusk that makes you turn the headlights on early. The river ran beside the highway like a strip of dull metal, and for the first time since this began, I felt the danger shift in a way I could measure. It was no longer scattered pieces of a mystery. It had a shape now, a face, a direction. Back at my house, Jack joined me inside. We sat at the dining table with the laptop between us, the room lit only by a lamp Miriam used to turn on at dusk. Jack asked to see the hospital footage again. I opened the file and let it play. He leaned in, eyes narrowed, studying every frame the way cops who never quite retire do. When Thomas Walsh looked up at the camera, Jack exhaled slowly. He shook his head. "Not Henry," he said, "but he wants people to think he is." He pointed at the screen. "Look at the way he carries himself. Same posture, same walk, same control of space. He is not hiding his resemblance. He is using it." We kept watching. Thomas entered Miriam's room, stayed just under a minute, and left without glancing back. Jack paused the footage there. If he wore a stolen badge, that means he had help inside. Someone cleaned the logs. Someone opened a side door. This is not a one-man operation. The more Jack dug, the more the truth surfaced. Henry's death in that warehouse fire might have been the end for him, but not for the network he built. Thomas had stepped into the vacuum impersonating his father when he needed to intimidate old associates, presenting himself as someone who carried the same ruthlessness. as long as people feared the Walsh name his power held. Jack took out his tablet and showed me something he had found. A series of encrypted messages pulled from a monitored account tied to one of Henry's former warehouse supervisors. The last message was a simple instruction sent 3 nights ago. Bring the boy to Ravenswood Bridge. My stomach tightened. Ravenswood Bridge had hovered in the background of this story from the start. It was where Eli's mother died in 1998. It was where Miriam had seen the truth. And now Thomas was using it as bait, sending digitized photos of Miriam to lure Eli into returning to the place that began his trauma. I told Jack I needed to talk to Eli. We drove to the diner where he said he would wait for me, a place near the interstate that stayed open all night. Eli sat in a booth in the back with a cup of coffee. He clearly had no intention of drinking. His eyes flicked from the door to the window every few seconds. When we slid into the booth across from him, he looked at the flash drive in my hand, then at Jack, then back at me. I told him what we had learned about Thomas. How he had worn his father's identity like armor. How he had been hunting the evidence Miriam protected. And how he had used Miriam's photos to try to pull Eli into the open. Eli's jaw locked. That bridge, he said. I knew they would try something there. I took a breath before telling him the next part. Back in 1998, I signed a manifest on a late shift. It was paperwork for a container that never made sense to me afterward. The numbers were wrong, but I was tired, and Henry was always hovering around those manifests. Years later, I understood that the container was part of the laundering route. By signing that form, even unknowingly, I had helped Henry hide one of the links in the chain. Miriam knew. She must have thought keeping me out of the investigation was the only way to protect me. Eli looked at me for a long time. Some of the distrust I had seen in his eyes earlier returned, then slowly faded. He nodded once. You did not know, he said. She knew you did not know. That is why she kept you out of it. The relief stung almost as much as the guilt. Jack leaned across the table. We do not have much time. I contacted the Ohio State Police before we came here. They are preparing a controlled setup at the bridge, but Samuel needs to reach Thomas first to keep him occupied long enough for us to close in. Eli immediately objected. He wanted to come. He said Thomas would not expect him to show fear. Jack shut that down quickly. They want you alive only long enough to retrieve what your mother found. After that, all bets are off. Let us finish this the right way. Eli stared down at the table, hands tight around the coffee mug. When he finally looked up, there was something steadier in his eyes. If you go alone, he said, he will think he has won. That is what people like him need. Let him believe it long enough for you to stop him. As we walked outside, the wind cut across the parking lot, carrying the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache. Jack stood beside his truck, outlining the final steps. The bridge would be monitored from both ends. Unmarked units would move in when Thomas revealed himself. But timing mattered. If Thomas sensed a trap too early, he would run. Or worse, he would shoot. I nodded, though my thoughts were already drifting toward the steel structure that had hung over the river for decades. The place where one life had ended and another had silently begun. The place where Miriam had stood in the dark 20 years ago, watching a truth she could never speak. The past was no longer behind me. It was waiting on that bridge, and I knew I had to walk into it alone. When I got into my truck and started the engine, I saw Eli through the diner window watching me leave. For a moment, I saw something in his expression that reminded me of the younger version of myself. A man caught between fear and resolve, trying to outrun a shadow he never asked for. The road to Ravenswood stretched ahead, dark and narrow, disappearing into a sky that promised more cold before dawn. I gripped the wheel, knowing every mile brought me closer to Thomas, closer to the truth and closer to whatever waited on that bridge where so many lives had been altered. I drove on, feeling the weight of 2 decades settle into the seat beside me. The road narrowed as I crossed into the outskirts, the kind of rural stretch where the headlights carve out their own world and everything else disappears into darkness. The closer I got to Ravenswood Bridge, the heavier the air felt, as if the river below was holding its breath. Rain began tapping against the windshield, first faint, then harder, turning the glass into a sheet of scattered reflections. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tighter as the steel frame of the bridge rose ahead like a dark spine against the sky. I slowed at the entrance. Jack's last message echoed in my mind. "Units are in position. Keep him talking until we move." That kind of plan always sounded clearer on paper. Reality never listened. I eased forward, my tires slipping slightly on the wet metal grating. The river below churned in the dim light, a shifting ribbon of black water. I pulled to a stop near the center and stepped out into the cold. Thomas Walsh stood about 20 yards ahead, backlit by a pair of headlights from a parked SUV. 2 men flanked him, both armed, both rigid. Thomas wore a dark coat soaked through at the shoulders, but he held himself like the rain couldn't touch him. He smiled when he saw me approach, the kind of smile that had no warmth in it at all. "You came alone." His voice carried easily across the steel. Brave or stupid, I cannot tell which. I walked forward slowly, palms slightly open at my sides. I was wet through my jacket within seconds, but I didn't let it show. He wanted a reaction. Men like him always did. I told him I was here for Eli, that the boy had lost too much already. Thomas tilted his head, amused. He said the boy was an inconvenience, the last thread left over from his father's work. He claimed he needed to end everything cleanly. He even boasted about Henry, saying his father had not run the woman down by accident. He had done it to retrieve the documentation she carried. He leaned in slightly, letting the rain drip from his chin. My father never fled. He finished what he started. The cold settled deeper inside my chest. I steadied my breathing, reminding myself why I was there. I let Thomas talk. I asked him questions not to argue, but to feed his ego, to keep him believing he was winning. When he stepped closer, the metal beneath him creaked under his weight. The wind picked up, carrying his voice across the bridge in broken pieces. I watched his hands. Watched the angle of the gun at his side. Every gesture told me something about how much time I had left. He eventually gestured behind me. "Bring him out." And that was when Eli stepped from the shadows near my truck. His face was pale in the rain, but he did not back away. Thomas stiffened, pleased that the bait had worked. He lifted his weapon toward the boy. The instant the barrel rose, the world exploded with light. Floodlights burst alive from both ends of the bridge, washing the steel in sharp white beams. Engines roared, boots hit metal, voices shouted commands over the wind. Thomas spun toward the noise, slipping on the slick grating. His foot slid out from under him, and for a second he hung at the edge of the rail arms, flailing against the pull of the river. One of the officers lunged and grabbed his jacket, yanking him back onto the bridge. His gun skittered across the wet steel and stopped a few feet from Eli. The 2 armed men dropped too, hands raised, pinned in place by lines of officers rushing in from both sides. The storm kept falling as they were cuffed, the bridge trembling under the weight of people and shouting, and adrenaline finally spilling free. Jack appeared through the glare, soaked as badly as I was, but steady. He gave me a nod. It was over. Not all of it, but enough for one night. Officers searched Thomas's SUV and brought out bags of evidence. A cloned drive, stacks of payoff records, names of people who had turned their backs for money, names tied to ports, judges, warehouse supervisors, a network that had stretched across more years than I wanted to count. Eli stood near the railing, shoulders shaking. Not from cold, from the force of everything he had carried alone. I walked to him, unsure what to say. When I reached him, he turned and stepped into me like he had done it 100 times before, burying his face against my jacket. I put my hand on the back of his head, the rain running down both of us. The truth had taken pieces from him that he would never get back, but it also saved him from a life shaped by someone else's lies. As the sirens echoed faintly in the distance, and the lights pulsed across the wet steel, I realized the bridge no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt like a place where something long overdue had finally begun. In the days after the bridge, everything felt quieter and louder at the same time. Quieter in the house, louder in my head. The image of Thomas being pulled back from the edge while sirens echoed over the river stayed with me, even when I closed my eyes. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside the window went from black to gray, listening to the refrigerator hum and the furnace kick on and off, like the house was breathing around me. The next week was a blur of offices and questions and signatures. Jack brought me to a meeting with a state investigator and an assistant prosecutor in Columbus. They laid out what they had already confirmed. The cloned drive from Thomas's vehicle matched entries on the flash drive Miriam left behind. Money trails, shell companies, port supervisors who looked the other way, judges who approved suspicious plea deals, and buried in all that references that aligned perfectly with the old 1998 file that had been closed too quickly. When they said the case would be officially reopened and that Miriam would be noted in the record as a coerced witness rather than a participant, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in years. She would never sit in that room to hear them say it never sign her name on a clean page, but the stain on her memory would not be the last word. A few days later, I got a call from the same attorney in Covington who had opened Caleb's dead man package. His voice was careful, respectful. He told me they had recovered a body near the river downstream from the warehouse district, and that dental records confirmed what we already knew in our gut. Caleb had paid the price for standing too close to a truth men like Thomas did not want spoken. Then the attorney said there was another package with my name on it left in his safe with a note that it should be handed over only if Caleb did not show up again. When I opened it, sitting in the dim light of my dining room, I found a small external drive wrapped in an old bandana and a short letter. In the letter, Caleb explained that this was the original copy of Henry's data. Not just the parts Henry had used to threaten Miriam, but everything he had gathered to control his own partners. Caleb had taken it years earlier when he realized Henry would never let anyone walk away clean. He said Miriam had begged him to keep it hidden until someone could use it without being destroyed by it. Jack came over and we plugged the drive into his laptop. We watched the screen fill with folders and subfolders, each named in bland corporate language that hid what they really were. Transaction logs, shipping manifests, accounts that moved money in careful steps from one place to another until it disappeared. The more we scrolled, the clearer it became that this network had not been a side operation. It was the skeleton of an entire way of doing business. Turning that drive over was easier than I expected. Holding on to it would not bring justice. Letting professionals tear it apart might. So I made copies for the investigators, one copy for a federal contact Jack trusted, and one that I locked away for a day when I might need to remember why Miriam had done what she did. Not out of revenge, but out of clarity. News came in pieces after that. One port manager quietly retired before an indictment could hit. A judge announced an early health-related resignation. A warehouse supervisor was suddenly no longer listed on company rosters. The system has its own slow way of bleeding out poison when enough light hits it. I tried not to track every headline. I had spent enough of my life in rooms where justice was a chess game. What mattered to me now was simpler. Eli. He met me one last time before being moved into a protection program run with state and federal cooperation. We sat on a bench in a small park not far from the bus station, the kind of place no one really notices in winter. He wore a jacket that was too thin for the wind that cut across the grass, but he did not complain. He had a small bag at his feet and a restless look in his eyes. He told me the agents had explained what would happen. New routines, new addresses, a life where he would always watch angles and exits. But it would be his life, not a script written by Henry or Thomas. He said he wanted to try to live the kind of ordinary day his mother never had time to reach, and the kind of peace Miriam had fought for without anyone seeing it. I told him I was proud of him. It felt odd to say it out loud, but it was true. He had every right to let anger harden him, to become another man defined by what had been taken from him. Instead, he chose to keep walking forward. Before he left, he gripped my hand and thanked me for believing him. I told him it was Miriam he should thank. She was the one who refused to look away when it was easier not to see. That night, when the house had gone quiet again, I opened a small folder the investigators had returned to me. Inside was a printed transcript from Miriam's last recording. At the very end, after she spoke about Henry and about Eli and about fear, she had said a few lines addressed directly to me in a softer tone. She wrote that she had always believed I was a better man than the job had allowed me to be. That she worried the truth about those years would crush whatever good was left in me. She said she chose to carry the weight herself because she could not bear to see my faith in the world broken the way hers had been. And then she asked for forgiveness she was sure she did not deserve. I sat there for a long time with that page in my hands. I thought about all the nights she sat at this table while I was on call, sorting through numbers and fears and the faces of people she barely knew but felt bound to protect. I thought about how dignity sometimes looks like silence, not because someone is weak, but because they are strong enough to hold what others cannot. In the months that followed, the idea of a foundation kept circling back into my mind. I had a pension from mid-states, some savings Miriam and I had set aside, and a purpose that would not leave me alone. Eventually, I went down to the courthouse and filed the papers for a small nonprofit in her name. The Miriam Reed Foundation would not be large, at least not at first, but it would do something she would have understood. Provide quiet help to kids like Eli, and to witnesses caught in the crosshairs of people who treat human lives like loose ends. On the first anniversary of her death, I drove back to Ravenswood Bridge. The investigation teams were gone, and the bridge looked ordinary again, just another piece of steel over a restless river. I parked at the same spot where I had stepped out into the rain that night. This time the sky was clear. I walked to the rail with a small bouquet of white roses in my hand. Miriam used to say white flowers made her think of second chances. I dropped them one by one into the water and watched the current carry them away. I thanked her quietly for keeping me alive long enough to see the truth, and for believing I could do something more with it than let it crush me. If you have ever lived with a secret sitting in the middle of your life or felt the weight of someone else's choices on your shoulders, then you know some of what I felt standing on that bridge. If this story reached you in a way you did not expect, stay with me for the next one, and let me know what part of it echoed the loudest in your own life. Sometimes the only way men like us get through the long nights is by knowing we are not carrying these stories alone.